Welcome. I'm Terry Collins, host and spirit medium of Perfect Pour, the show that takes you around the world of craft beer and spirits. And we want you to join us as we discover, taste, review, and learn about these wonderful beers and spirits. We'll sit down with Beer Temple owner Cicerone and all-around craft beer expert Chris Quinn. Chris is very passionate and knowledgeable about all things craft beer, and he gets to share some of that with us. We'll also review tasting notes on 2 expressions of Kilchoman Scotch Whiskies, and we'll finish up with an interesting yet old style of beer called Goza, with the Anderson Valley beer called the Kimmie, the Yink, and the Holy Gose. So join us. Cheers. Now this is a part of the show that I've really been looking forward to because I get to review a couple of Scotch whiskies from Kilchoman. They are the epitome, in my opinion, of craft. They are a small outfit on Islay, and the characteristic that most of you may or may not know about Islay whiskeys is that they're very peaty or smoky, and Kilchoman is no exception. They're an outfit that started in 2005, so they're very young. They had their first release 3 years later, which, if you think about it, for Scotch whiskies to have a release that early it's extraordinary. The thing we know about most Scotch whiskies is they have, if they're single malts, is that they have age statements on them. Typically, the Kilchomans to this point haven't because they're still less than 10 years old, and their young releases have been exceptional. And we have 2 from Kilchoman here today. We have Mocker Bay, which is their flagship whiskey, and we have Winter 2010. And the thing about both of these is they're slightly overproof at 46%, and you'll notice very pale color, no chill filtering, and no added colors. The thing about Kilchoman, which makes them, I think, exceptional, is they want to do everything sourced from Islay itself. What that means is they want to grow their own barley, they want to bottle, they want to distill everything on Islay. And actually, I believe they want to do it on their own farm, which is, they have a farm that surrounds the distillery. Part of their malt comes from there, part comes from Port Ellen, which supplies a lot of the malts for the other Islay whiskeys, or Islay distilleries. So they're doing things in a right way. It's small, they probably make as much as some of the larger distilleries spill in a year. I think it's something like 100,000 barrels, which is a drop in the bucket for the larger distilleries on Islay or anywhere in Scotland. And these are exceptional. They have a good price point. They're accessible, especially if you're just getting into or are interested in trying the Islay peated scotches. And they've got a lot going for them. The first one I want to talk about is the Mocker Bay. And we do this the same with all of our tastings for Scotch and bourbon and Irish whiskey. We like to pour it in the glass, smell, use our senses. We like to see how it looks. You see the pale color. We like to pick it up and smell it and taste it before we add any water to it, which you may or may not want to do eventually, but it's nice to try initially because it changes the character of the liquor. In our tasting notes, without water, for Mocker Bay, we get a peaty, smoky nose up front, fresh peat. Some of the other Islas will have, that are matured longer, have an older sort of peated smell. This is a very fresh peat. And past the peat, there's hints of sweet fruit, green grass, straw, and then the taste, without adding water, we get sweetness and a big kick of peaty smoke, which you'd expect from an Islay whiskey, and we certainly do from Kilchoman. And there's sort of an ashy or tarry taste. From my tasting, it was sort of almost a hint of coal tar. Just a hint, and I think that adds to the complexity. It's something very different from the normal peat. The mouthfeel we found was somewhat silky due to the lack of chill filtering, which is a good thing. The finish is long with a sweet, smoky character. And then the thing I liked about it and that I'm most impressed by with the Mocker Bay is what I call a peat echo. What I mean by that is you get a burst of peat up front, and then you get the other flavors that come through as I described, and then you let your senses sort of experience it, and then eventually you get another hint of peat at the back of your tongue. It's very interesting. It's what I call a peat echo. I've not experienced it before, but I found it with this Kilchoman Mocker Bay, and it's really extraordinary. Then we add some water to it. It changes the character. The nose changes, becomes even sweeter. It tames the smoke a little bit, and the taste also sweetens up. There's less of the ash, and for me it was less of the coal tar that came through with a splash of water, but still there's plenty of smoke. The finish has more of a lasting sweetness the sweetness moving to the back of the mouth and taming the smoke somewhat. So this one, if you like a young, fresh peat taste, then you do very well to try the Machar Bay. It's definitely peaty, but it's an accessible sort of peat, a combination of sweet and smoky, which is really nice. And then we have our second bottle, which is the Kilchoman 2010 vintage. This one's a little different. The Machar Bay has a sherry finish, so it's matured in sherry casks to finish. The 2010 vintage is just matured in Buffalo Trace barrels, so it does not have the sherry finish, which is a very different thing. For the Kilchoman Winter 2010 release, we have for our tasting notes, for the smell, we have the nose with a lot of smoke, and as I typically get from Scotch and bourbon and sometimes Irish whiskey, I get the ammonia, a hint of ammonia. And I get that usually until I swill the glass around, and that goes away. Fresh grains come through, a small bit of fruitiness. And the taste without water is raw, but not in a bad way. You can tell it's young, and these are very young Scotches. It's young, has some burn to it, a lot of smoke, and some fresh grain. The finish is long, slightly bitter, and I got from the vintage 2010, I got a bitterness like strong black unsweetened tea, which I've never gotten in a Scotch before, so this was exceptional. The smoke goes up the nose, very aromatic, has less of an ash or tarry taste than the Machar Bay. Then with a little bit of water, things change. The smell and taste are mellower, you get sort of woody smell, the peat tones down into a woody smoke. Some burnt sugar, but still, I guess I got some of the ammonia out of it even with the water, even though it was toned down. The taste is more creamy and balanced with a mix of sweet and bitter, a bit of grain, and a little bit of burn. The water seems to have the sweet carry through longer, and also some of the woody smoke. I think it's a little more complex than the Machar Bay, but in either case, you can't go wrong with these. These are both exceptional. They're made well. They're craft products. They're packaged right. They're produced right. And you can tell that a lot of passion goes into them. The price point is accessible. Again, if you're getting into Islas, these are the perfect things to do it with. Any release by Kilchoman is hard to find. You might see it once, you might come back and it'll be gone. You'll see the vintages come out a couple times a year, at least two. I think they have a winter and summer. They may do spring and falls for the vintages. The Machar Bay is always there, but the years are going to change. They release it every year, but it's all very limited. They make small amounts of their product. And if you can't find them in a liquor store, you can search for them online. They're worth searching out because they are exceptional. And I think they're only going to get better. Again, they're not even 10 years old. So they're releasing very young Scotches, but they're very accessible and it's exciting. Every time one comes out, there's a lot of press about them that seems to be very good. They're accepted very well in the community, and the Scotch tasters love them. And I've really been excited with each of them that I've tasted, and I can't wait for the next one. But again, if you see them, you might want to jump on them because you might not see them again. They're very hard to find because they are very popular and they're in such limited quantity. And they are the epitome of craft spirits, and that's why we have them here and we're excited about them on Perfect Pour.
The easiest way to put it would be a beer sommelier. So I have been certified, I've been tested to be able to just know beer on a variety of levels, from the brewing process to styles to flavors and off flavors, and pairing beer with foods. Just to be able to really help people pick out a beer that they are going to enjoy. Well, the first thing I want to find out is what kind of beer are they looking for? What kind of beer do they like? I'm not going to help anybody by giving them something they don't want, by giving them this big imperial bourbon barrel-aged stout when all they know is Budweiser and Bud Light. They're not going to like it, most likely. So what I try to do is figure out what they're looking for. Are they interested in trying something new, or do they want to try maybe a different version of beers that they're used to? In the case of, in the example that you just gave, I would push them towards an all malt version of a lager. I would push them towards a German lager, maybe a Helles. A lot of people think that they're drinking Pilsners. These Budweisers and the macro beers, let's call them, they're not really Pilsners. In fact, Pilsners are going to have a lot more bite to them. So I usually scale it down and I'll do a Helles, something a little bit more malty, bready, easier to drink for them. And I'll tell you, I mean, a lot of people knock lagers, light lagers and pale lagers.
Certainly based on what's been produced here by the majors.
Right, but when you have a truly world-class version of these beers, you see why they came to dominate the world, because they are amazingly good beers. The blog started before the store opened, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Yeah, I've been doing that for a while. It was...
That's why there are 200 and something out there.
Yeah, there's like 230 of them out there. They're video reviews of beers. Sometimes I'll do specific beers or breweries or styles. And what it is, I just turn the camera on myself, I hit record, I drink the beer, you're kind of tasting along with me, and then I tell you kind of what I think of it. And off the top of my head, I'll give you some information about the history of the style, if we're doing a style show, and really just try to open up beer and demystify it for some people, and also let people know that it's still just beer. You know, I'll have a lot of these quote-unquote rare or whale beers that are very hard to find, but I treat them just like every other beer out there, because at the end of the day, it's just beer. It's just beer. An Italian beer called My Blueberry Nightmare that you are familiar with as well. Just absolutely, I mean, the Italians are certainly esoteric brewers.
Now let's think about this. This is an Italian craft beer. Until I came to your store when we were here for the 1-year anniversary, I had only heard about Peroni and Moretti from Italy.
Right, yeah.
I didn't know anything about any other types of beers coming from Italy. So this is really remarkable.
Yeah, and there's quite a few craft breweries out there in Italy.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's really kind of a burgeoning scene. I'd say in Europe, it's really on fire, some of these Italian beers. The issue with some of these Italian beers is, unlike in America, where there was this homebrew tradition where people were just experimenting over and over and over and over, they don't really have that in Italy. And they still have this really wild passion for trying new things and wanting to be creative and artistic with their beer. But they might not have some of the fundamentals down. So at times you get they kind of want to run before they can walk sometimes. Sometimes it works out and you get these amazing beers that just comes together, and sometimes they're kind of catastrophes. The beer that I was just about to talk about isn't really either of them, but it's typical of some of the really crazy flavors that you can get put together in a beer. So the beer was called My Blueberry Nightmare, and it was a stout that they aged for, I think, 2 years with souring bacteria and added blueberries to them. They aged them in barrels. And the bacteria basically ate away all the sugar, ate away all the body, and created a lot of vinegar, basically acetobacter. They made some acetic acid in there. So at the end, this bottled, quote unquote stout was completely bone dry. It had no sugar, no body. It tasted like vinegar. And then they also, I forgot to mention, added chilies to it. So on top of the blueberries, you had a sour stout that was hot from
Not
chilies.
Something you expect from Italy.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's out there.
That is out there.
Yeah.
Really out there.
But other beers that are a little bit out there that work really well is there's right here in Chicago, there's a wit beer by Five Rabbit Brewing. It's called Five Lizard. And where a typical Belgian wit beer has coriander and bitter orange peel added, they kept the coriander, but they switched out the orange peel for lime peel and added a bit of passion fruit to it.
Okay, and I should mention that Five Rabbit has sort of a Latin flavor to their brews.
Yeah.
So the lime fits in.
Right, the lime and the passion fruit. And they kind of nodded to tradition. They made a wit beer, but then they tweaked it. And I think it worked out beautifully, and it's really just a great example of what's happening in America right now. Just a really kind of, in a way, off-the-wall beer, but if you look at it, it kind of makes sense. And when you drink it, it tastes really good, which is the most important thing. Goza is a style of German wheat beer. It, for a while, had gone extinct. It is from a town traditionally of Leipzig, Germany. And during the Cold War, it was part of the Eastern German state, and the communist state would not allow wheat to be used for breweries. So this beer was, for all intents and purposes, kind of outlawed. And it went away.
Wow.
Yeah. So after the fall of communism, the style started to get slowly but surely revamped. And it's really become kind of a darling of the craft beer scene in just the last year. It's a really kind of cool beer. It's, like I mentioned, it's a wheat beer. It has a little bit of coriander in it. And more interesting, they have some souring bacteria, some lactobacillus, which is actually used in like yogurt and stuff like that. And they salt it as well.
That is what I found to be the most interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Really.
So it's just a really great, refreshing beer. It's lemony, it's a little bit tart, and the salt is really quenching, I think. I really have been looking for a kind of sessionable sour beer, and I think Goza is one of those beers. There's a couple of them that are kind of on the horizon that people are starting to get more and more into, and I think this is just a great warm weather beer like you mentioned.
Wonderful.
This is the Anderson Valley Goza. It's called the Kimmie, the Yink, and the Holy Gose Ale.
I want to thank Chris Quinn of the Beer Temple in Chicago for taking the time to share some of his passion for craft beer with us on Perfect Pour. And I want you to visit his website, his video blog at craftbeertemple.com. It's an excellent resource that has reviews and comparisons of different styles of beer. A really excellent resource. And in fact, Chris's passion, what we saw in the interview, inspired me to find out more about this wonderful style of beer called Goza. As you heard from Chris, he gave some of the history of it. We did some tasting, we gave some tasting information on it. I found out a little bit more. It's hard to find information on it. It's not a very widely known style. What I did find out, in addition to what Chris already mentioned, was that its style goes back to the 16th century in a town called Goza in central Germany, a town through which the river Goza actually runs. It's a river that has very minerally water content, and that was used to brew the original beer. And as a byproduct, so the mineral and salt content from the river, the flavor came through in the beer. And so that's a staple of Goza. Another staple of Goza is the fact that it's made with at least 50% wheat malt. It's made with top fermenting or ale yeast, and it also has salt added to it for the places where it's made without river, saltwater content. An additional feature of Goza is that it's made with lactobacillus, which is used to make yogurt, cheese, and it acts in Goza as a bittering agent, so it has a sort of tang to it, different from the sort of tang you get from the Brettanomyces that are used in Belgian ales. Another interesting fact, historically, about Goza is that it sits somewhere outside of the German purity law known as the Reinheitsgebot. And in that law, which also dates from the 16th century, maybe even the 15th century, it states that beer can only be made from 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. At the time the law came about, they didn't know what yeast was, so that wasn't included in there. The interesting thing about Goza was that survived the German purity law intact, even though it had added salt, lactobacillus, and was made with mostly wheat malt. A very interesting concept, and it was sort of grandfathered in as a local style. There were a few such things in Germany. So Goza sits outside of the German purity law, and it remained a popular style in Northern Europe, centered around Leipzig, as Chris mentioned, up until just after World War II. And it was extinct actually for over 40 years, until 1986, when it was restarted in Leipzig. And since then, a few German breweries have picked it up in Leipzig. And actually, most of the production of Goza has come from the United States, such breweries as Boulevard in Kansas City, Shell's in New Ulm, Minnesota, the Widmer Brothers in Portland, Oregon, and the one that Chris tasted and that we have right here, Anderson Valley, which is, again, the Kimmie, the Yink, and the Holy Gose. And you'll notice it's in their Highway 128 series, which is a series of session beers, usually limited production, although I do hope they make it again because it's an outstanding beer. And in terms of the tasting notes, you heard from Chris about the citrus notes and coriander. It's a very clean, it's a very dry beer with the saltiness. And the thing about the saltiness is unless someone points out to you that there's a salty content to this beer, you may not even know it. It's very subtle, but it comes through, and I think it adds to the quenching nature of the beer, and as does the dryness. And if you have this on a really hot day, it really breaks through and is really very quenching. You can see it's almost got a lemony, citrusy sort of color to it. It's a very light colored beer. It's really like nothing I've ever tasted. There are sour beers from Belgium and from northern Germany. There are wheat beers that have a sort of a similar grain bill, but they end up tasting very different because they're not spiked with the lactobacillus, and they certainly don't have the salt. But every version of Goza that's true to the style will have this salty character to it. And Anderson Valley does a great job with it, with the Kimmie, the Yink, and the Holy Gose. So I'd like to thank Chris Quinn of the Beer Temple here in Chicago for inviting us to the 1-year anniversary of the Beer Temple and taking the time to sit down with us and share his passion and his knowledge of beer styles, including this new beer style, or new old beer style, Goza. For Perfect Pour, I'm Terry Collins, your host and spirit medium, inviting you to join us again as we continue to explore the world of craft beer and spirits, right here on Perfect Pour. Cheers.